I'm Jackie Paré.
This meeting is being recorded.
This meeting is being recorded, okay, for LMC TV. So you can tell people who missed today that they can catch it on LMC TV. I'm Jackie Paré, head of programming for the Friends of the Larchmont Library. We'd hoped to have seen you all in person today, but unfortunately we still have to have masks, and we wouldn't have been able to do our legendary wine and cheese reception. So here we are again on Zoom. But it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to fellow Larchmonter Julian Sancton, author of the widely acclaimed Madhouse at the End of the Earth, the Belgica's journey into the Dark Antarctic Night, which has been described as a feverishly compelling tale, and I can attest to that, of an expedition gone horribly awry. Madhouse is now out in paperback and on the recommended lists of many book clubs across the country and bookshops, including two of my favorites, Anderson's here in Larchmont and the Corner Bookstore on 93rd and Madison. I saw it on the shelf the other day in the recommended bookshelf, which is great. Julian is a senior features editor at Departures magazine, where he writes about culture and travel. His work has appeared in the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, and Esquire, among other publications. He has reported from every continent, including Antarctica, which he visited while researching this book. He lives in Larchmont with his partner and his two children. Before we begin, we invite you all to chime in with your questions and comments along the way, and we'll try to get to all of you. So I'll start things off. Welcome, Julian.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So this wasn't the first attempt to reach Antarctica. These efforts go back hundreds of years. Even Aristotle had seen it, albeit in his mind's eye. Why did you choose this particular voyage, and how did you discover the story?
Well, I would say that I chose this because I had never heard about it. I first read of the Belgica journey in 2015. I was flipping through the New Yorker magazine at my desk at Departures. I should add that I'm no longer at Departures. I'm at the Hollywood Reporter now, but at that point I was at Departures, and killing time by flipping through my favorite magazine. And I chanced on an article that was about NASA's preparations for manned missions to Mars. And in typical New Yorker fashion, the article sort of backed into the story. It started in this unexpected way, and it started in Antarctica in 1897 with a short summary of this remarkable expedition. And in those few paragraphs were already all the elements that attracted me to this story. There was this idea of people losing their minds in the poles, this idea of people being the expedition being the only men on the last unknown continent, the 17 men in an area the size of North America, just alone, stranded and marooned. That was just so remarkable to me. And then the idea of insanity being associated with the extremes of the earth, that brought to mind Gothic literature of the 19th century, or everything from Poe to Jules Verne to later H.P. Lovecraft. I found there was a literary quality to it. And when I heard that these were the first men to endure the cruelties of an Antarctic winter, and that they suffered terribly, both physically and mentally, physically largely of scurvy and among other maladies, and mentally for reasons that nobody could really explain. I just loved that mystery. That also I found that particularly compelling. And then the cherry on the cake was that among the crew, or rather among the officers of this Belgian-led expedition, were two future titans of polar exploration. One is Roald Amundsen, who even I at that point, I didn't know much about polar exploration, but even I knew he was the man who quote unquote conquered the South Pole, the famous Norwegian explorer who beat Robert Falcon Scott in this highly publicized and very exciting race to the South Pole in 1911. He cut his teeth on the Belgica expedition, so that all caught my attention. And finally, I think what really clinched it for me was the participation of absolutely just stupendous character named Frederick Cook, who was the sole American on board. He was the ship's surgeon, and if it weren't for his interventions, his incredibly resourceful and almost, I would say, delusionally optimistic interventions, then it's safe to say that nobody would have returned to civilization to tell this story. And the fact that Cook would go on to be one of the most maligned figures in polar exploration later on, and remembered, if he's remembered at all, as one of the great frauds of American history for having faked his attainment of the North Pole and faked many other things, and ended up in Leavenworth prison for running a Ponzi scheme. If it weren't for this anti-hero, there would have not been a story to tell. So I love this idea of the heroic anti-hero. That was just such a great contrast. And my favorite characters have always had that kind of ambiguity. Everybody from Indiana Jones to Han Solo to Sherlock Holmes and Butch Cassidy. So I found this irresistible character. And when I found out that he died in New Rochelle, that felt like a sign. As I did my research, I found evidence that he lived his last few years with a friend in Larchmont, as supposedly to take care of this friend's elderly mother, but in fact, it's because his friend took pity on him after leaving Leavenworth Penitentiary. Cook could no longer practice medicine. He was old, he couldn't see in one eye, but his friend remembered him as the great explorer that he had once been. And so he, out of pity, almost brought him in. And so that's how he ended up in Larchmont. So
where did he live? What house? Where?
He lived in the manor. He lived on Park Avenue, and it's a mission style house right now. You could there's still a view of the gazebo, and that's when I was started writing. In fact, when I was writing my proposal, I sat in the manor and trying to put myself in Cook's shoes. Actually, he was probably bedridden at that point, but looking out the window and seeing the sea for the last time, he probably saw it from Larchmont.
Amazing. So tell us about the other two protagonists, main people in the crew. Yeah.
Oh, well, there were. It's just a fantastic cast of characters, and they're all flawed in their way and heroic in their way. The expedition was the brainchild of a Belgian aristocrat who, at that time, was in his late 20s, named Adrien de Gerlache, and he was he was from a young age obsessed with the sea. Even though he grew up in a military family and a family of great importance in Belgium, one of his ancestors had been the first prime minister of the young country. Even though he had that background, he was obsessed with going out and working his way up the hierarchy of the merchant marine, to the extent that it existed. It was actually a bare bones maritime presence, and so he was able to climb quite quickly. The Belgians didn't have much of a maritime tradition, and the Dutch had taken over. When the two countries separated, the Dutch had inherited all of those responsibilities. But he, for some reason, just was fixated on that horizon, and managed to find his way into the pantheon of great polar explorers by out of thin air, when he had heard that in the late 1890s, all the geographical societies of the world had convened and decided that the most urgent, the region of the world that most urgently required exploration was the Antarctic. Indeed, it had been several decades since man had first stepped foot on Antarctic soil, but nobody had spent more than a few hours on Antarctic land, and to think that an entire continent remained unseen until 1820 is, for me, that was just baffling, and for de Gerlache as well. It was an invitation to fill in this void at the bottom of world maps, and to put his name on the map, but also put Belgium's name on the map, because if he framed this as he did, as a nationalist endeavor, I would say patriotic nationalist is a loaded term. If you frame this as a patriotic endeavor, then it would be, it would allow him to fly the new Belgian flag to all corners of the earth, and to attract press attention. So this was also to both to his glory and to his country's. And he was smart enough to also frame it as a scientific endeavor, because at that time in the science had replaced military conquest or religious justifications as a reason for exploration. And having conquered the known world, the Western powers decided now they were going to try to understand it. And so that's why we have and naturalists like von Humboldt or Darwin becoming the sort of spearheading the new wave of exploration. And so de Gerlache ends up deciding that he, of all people, even though he had no polar experience at all, and in fact he had no experience as a captain, would spearhead the first scientific mission to Antarctica. It was an unbelievably, I would say, audacious move to think that he would be able to do that. And his you might also say hubristic, because he was not up to the challenge. He was a good seaman, but he was not a good leader of men. And the challenges were visible from the beginning. He was not able to scrape together enough qualified Belgian sailors to man his ship, and those he was able to get together were a rowdy, undisciplined, and anti-authoritarian bunch. And so he filled out the ranks with Eastern European scientists and Norwegian seamen, which from the get-go compromised the patriotic nature of his trip. And so he was torn both ways. He felt a tremendous amount of anguish about the way he would be portrayed in the Belgian press, and that led to some poor decisions down the line, as we'll see.
So that goes for the crew as well. They weren't necessarily experienced.
Not all of them. There were a few. In fact, the only one who had any polar experience at all was Cook. He had been on an Arctic mission with Parry, the future. Well, for a long time we thought he was the discoverer of the North Pole, and although in the last few decades that record has been questioned as well. But Robert Peary was a great Arctic explorer, another American, and Cook had been his right-hand man, his surgeon, and his liaison to Inuit communities up there. And so he did have some experience. He wintered. He spent the winter in northern Greenland, and so he knew exactly how harsh and cruel a polar winter could be. And as such, he was the only one determined not to spend another one, although that plan would end up going awry. But the other crew, there were some good sailors, in fact, and there were some sailors who had, particularly the Norwegians, who had taken part in fishing expeditions that did actually make their way into the Arctic, but during the summer, and none of them ever really had to deal with polar ice. And ice navigation is its own beast, and they didn't have. They were a hardscrabble or a ragtag bunch, I should say, and not quite prepared.
Were there enough of them, and was the ship itself seaworthy enough to make
the ship was unbelievably solid? It was a small, it was a small ship. It wasn't particularly handsome, but de Gerlache sort of fell in love with her when he saw her among the Norwegian fishing fleet in the mid 1890s, and he decided that he had to have her. But she was a little bit run down, and she didn't look like much, but she really he probably couldn't have picked a better ship in the end. She was built very solidly.
So they set off, and what was their intent? What was his intention in terms of how long it would take?
Right. The intention was to, as I said, there was no, or very, very little was known about the continent aside from a few fragmentary coastlines on a few maps. And there had not been a rigorous scientific exploration, certainly not of the area that he was going to, which is the Antarctic Peninsula, which is immediately south of South America. It's the peninsula that points vaguely toward South America. His plan was to spend a few months with the scientists exploring the geology, the meteorology, the flora, the fauna, the oceans in that region. But he had another goal that he thought would electrify the public, and that is to pinpoint the South Magnetic Pole, which is distinct from the geographic pole. It's not what we all imagine as the area, the theoretical point where all meridians meet and from which all directions are north. That's what we think of as the South Pole. The South Magnetic Pole is the center of magnetic activity in that region. There's one in the north and there's one in the south, and they are in perpetual movement because they depend on the churn of magma in the Earth's core, and the electric activity of that generates magnetic activity. And so as it had never been pinpointed, but it had been suspected that it was on the other side of Antarctica, so on the other side of the globe. And finding this point is useful in as much as it allows cartographers and navigators to correct their readings and their observations, their coordinates, and their bearings, more importantly. But more importantly than that, it would have been a great exploit and a great coup, something he could crow about back home. And these two goals that I just described, one which is the rigorous systematic study of an area, scientific study of an area, which requires a lot of time and a lot of attention. That's on one side of the globe, and then you have, or the continent, and then the race to get to the other side of the other hemisphere, to get to the magnetic pole. These were two incompatible goals. There was one required going very slowly and rigorously, the other one required going very fast before the winter ice set in, and which would have prevented the ship from making a landing. And Deja Vu was not able to square that circle. He was not able to reconcile those two goals. And that's because, for a variety of reasons, they were delayed on the way down to South America by an almost comical concatenation of disasters, including a near mutiny, including a grounding that almost spelled the end of the expedition before they even left South America, various fights and people being kicked off the ship, and then the fact that he had to. He felt compelled to indulge the scientists in their curiosity, so that every time, even before they got to Antarctica, they were just so excited that every time the naturalist, the Romanian naturalist Emil Rakovița, would found a tide pool, he would spend hours looking at it, trying to see if there were any new species of microscopic spider there or something. And so days went by, and the calendar was ticking away. By the time they had performed the study of that area and charted the area that they had gotten to, which is now known as the Gerlache Strait after Commander de Gerlache, it was too late to make it to Victoria Land, where the magnetic pole was thought to be, before the winter ice set in. So he did try to go, but when he realized that it was not going to be possible, he was left with a dilemma. Either he goes back to Belgium, hat in hand. Oh, did I freeze? Oh, no. Either he goes back to Belgium, hat in hand, and asking for more funds, and explaining that he did not have much to show for his first year of expedition, aside from a few remarkable scientific achievements, such as the discovery of the only known native Antarctic animal, which is a small Antarctic midge that doesn't fly,
A
or
midge?
a little fly. It's kind of an insect,
Okay.
and because there's so much wind there in Antarctica, it evolved to not have wings. But that, that's a remarkable discovery, but it's not the kind of thing that will get you front page headlines. And so he decided either he goes home and to a form of humiliation, he didn't achieve what he set out to, or he decides he could change plans and head south, even though he knew that the ice was closing in on him. He saw that there was a storm had broken up the pack ice, which is the sort of skirt of ice around the entire continent. And a terrible storm in his region had created all sorts of leads, which are these sort of avenues through the ice of open water. And he made the extremely consequential decision to seek shelter. That was his justification, but in fact, he decided to go south and pursue a reckless southern course, even though he knew it would likely mean that the ship would be caught in the ice, and even though he had assured his crew that he would not attempt any such thing and that they would not winter in the ice, and even though he knew that it would likely spell the death of several of his men. He also knew that it would mean that there would be an incredible story to tell, and for an explorer, that is as valuable a resource as anything else. He didn't discover gold or oil or anything, any natural resource, but he did know that he would be coming home with something worth writing a memoir about, and something that would, if he survived, which is an important caveat, would make put his name in history books.
You quoted George Mallory in the epigraph. Sometimes science is the excuse for exploration. I think it is rarely the reason. So
absolutely, yeah. Mallory said that years later, upon his prior to his final attempt at Everest. But I think it applies here. It really is. It's not to say that he shortchanged the science. He was the men he brought along, those who survived, the scientists, were absolutely petrified of wintering in the ice. But when they got back, the expedition brought back such a bounty of data and of specimens that it took 40 years to sort through and continued to inform science and to enrich the science of Antarctica. And they went on to really illustrious careers. One of them, whose name was Dobrolowski, invented the term the cryosphere, which is now what we consider the everything from the Earth's ice-covered environments, everything from the poles to the permafrost to glacier systems. That was his term. Also the director of the New York Public Library was aboard the Belgica. He didn't shortchange the science, but it was definitely, for him, was an excuse to be able to justify going to Antarctica.
This is probably a good time to just break and you show us some slides that you prepared.
I'd love to. That would be a good way to get through the story. Let me share my screen. All right, entire screen. Let's do that. All right, and forgive me if it's okay. So this is de Gerlache. Are you seeing this?
Yes, seeing.
This is Adrien de Gerlache. Before, this is when you see the optimism in his eyes. He's dressing up as he thinks a polar explorer would look, but he'd never even come close. And you'll see a very different de Gerlache as the scurvy takes hold of him. This is Cook shortly before the expedition. He grew a beard because he figured that made doctors appear more serious. He was very young here; he was in his early 20s, and he also decided to grow a beard after his wife died in childbirth, and the child died too. And he decided, as he wrote, men grow beards during during dark times of the soul. So that's Cook for you. This is Roald Amundsen, a very young Amundsen. And I describe his mustache as a seagull in flight, which I think kind of he's a very serious man, and I can't help but laugh at his mustache. But in the time, it was very fetching. This is the captain of the ship. De Gerlache was the commander of the expedition, but he couldn't have chosen a better captain. This man is named Georges Lecointe. He was a specialist of celestial navigation and an astronomer, and he was their sort of onboard GPS. Just an absolute brilliant scientist, and without him, I'm sure that the expedition would have run into even more trouble. And on the way down, Cook, who was not only the ship's surgeon, the expedition's surgeon, but also its photographer, took remarkable images and took remarkable notes about the native tribes, the indigenous tribes of Tierra del Fuego. And these are images of the Ona people, which is a tribe that also known as the Selknam, and they are lost. There are nobody still claims Selknam heritage, and so these are extremely valuable documents that he took. Some of the first and images ever taken of that people. This is I don't want to say what happens to him, but I had a very soft spot for him. He was a 19-year-old Norwegian sailor, and I was very lucky to find his diary. This is when I embarked on the project, I didn't know that this diary existed, but librarians that I had consulted with spoke to other librarians, and who spoke to other librarians, and through the grapevine, it became known that I was working on this project. And somebody pulled out of the Norwegian Maritime Museum in Oslo, said, "Well, we have Vinca's diary," and he ended up he didn't suffer such a he suffered a pretty grave fate. And so the fact that I had his thoughts and his hopes and dreams written down, I was able to really build out this character that frequently the crew is treated as an afterthought or disposable. And somebody asked, didn't Magellan identify the indigenous peoples that are in Cook's photographs? Yes, absolutely. Magellan and Darwin as well. But Magellan couldn't take photos. And Darwin did describe the Yagan people, and they were very misunderstood. I think Cook took a much more empathetic stance towards the Fuegian people than Darwin, who considered them cannibals and barely civilized. And Cook took pity on them, especially the way they were being treated by the settlers. This is the Belgica in the Gerlache Strait. This is a photo that Cook took, and you have to imagine the pains that he took to climb to this altitude. As you can see, it probably the on his side of the strait probably looks a lot like the other side of the strait, and he was lugging pretty heavy camera equipment around. He was a great climber, and he taught Amundsen to climb as well, and the two were always seeking adventure. This is Rakovica. I love the fact that there were these well-stocked labs aboard the ship, and he was the naturalist aboard, and so he's looking at some kind of slide there in his microscope, and he probably studying phytoplankton, which he was a specialist of. This is the other main scientist, named Henrik Arktowski, and he was the meteorologist and geologist and oceanographer, and a very severe man. And as lively as Rakovica was, this man was very much in keeping with his specialist as a geologist, was a hard and flinty, unsmiling man. Emil Danko, the ship's magnetician, who did not have any qualifications to be such, but he was de Gerlache's best friend, would not he would not be coming home. But I don't want to explain how. This is what I call Cook's masterpiece. Cook was the photographer, as I've mentioned, and to take this shot, which was taken by moonlight on June 2nd, 1898, when he seemed to be, as everybody else was malingering, everybody else was suffering greatly from scurvy and other ailments, Cook managed to make himself busy, and he survived in part because of that. He fared so well because of how busy he was, in part because he was tending to his shipmates and his services were needed, but in part as well because he had become obsessed with photography. And this shot took, which shows how convulsed the ice had been by the ice pressures. This shot took an hour and a half by moonlight to take, but it's just a really beautiful shot, just the crispness of it. And for me, it evokes the sense of a ghost ship, which was true to what was going on inside. This is the crew in the forecastle. Several of these men would end up going mad. And this is de Gerlache with an emperor penguin. They did take 2 penguins on board as pets, but they quickly died. But the penguin was their spirit animal in a way, because it's thanks to the penguin that they survived, because of Cook's genius insight that the food that they were eating, the canned food they were eating, was clearly not sufficient. It was clearly not preventing them from getting scurvy. And he reasoned that the Inuit in the north, with whom he was quite familiar, oh, my battery, yes, good call. The Inuit did not have access to fresh, known anti-scorbutic foods, such as limes or lemons or any number of other foods, and yet they didn't have scurvy. And so the Cook figured that their diet of barely cooked, if not raw, fresh meat must have some anti-scorbutic, or that is scurvy fighting properties. And so he forced the men to eat raw penguin, those who could ingest it. Many refused, like our friend de Gerlache here, refused to eat it because it was, in part because it was disgusting, but in part also because he felt, I guess, duty bound to eat the food that he had bought with the budget that people had, that his many financiers had raised, and he didn't find it civilized. He didn't find it Belgian, worthy of a Belgian to eat penguin. In the end, he suffered the most from scurvy because of that, his resistance to eating penguin. But he finally took at death's door, took Cook's advice. This is de Gerlache. He suffered, as I mentioned, he suffered more than practically anybody aboard who survived. He was in his cabin here, and I suggest that one of the reasons he suffered the most, that he would spend hours just sitting there and apart, isolating himself from his shipmates. One of the reasons that he suffered greatly of migraines, among other things, was that the fumes from the dark room were particularly toxic, because Cook had run out of hypo solution and replaced it with hydrocyanic acid, which is also known as prussic acid, which is the active ingredient in Zyklon B. It's deadly. It's a deadly poison, and they would have had nowhere else to escape those fumes than in de Gerlache's cabin. So I suggest, although I can't say conclusively, that he might have been the victim of chronic cyanide poisoning. This is him in the throes of scurvy. As you see, it's quite a different de Gerlache we see than the heroic figure he posed as before leaving on the expedition. And Cook as well, looking quite messianic. He had become a sun worshipper. One of his another one of his great interventions was, another one of his great insights is that he realized that the darkness itself was having a profound effect on the men, not just depressing them, but almost he saw almost a physical effect of darkness. He thought that he could that the darkness was responsible for the men's wildly fluctuating, wildly erratic heart rates, and he concluded that the sun was somehow he called it a governor, that it kept the heartbeat regular, and that the men needed the sun as much as plants need the sun, and so he essentially invented phototherapy or light therapy, which is used routinely now. You expose people with seasonal affective disorder or other related forms of depression to very bright light. That is still used today and still believed to have benefits for people suffering from those ailments. But this was one of he is credited as one of the pioneers of light therapy, because he had the men stand for hours instead of in front of a roaring fire naked. He called it the baking treatment, and his idea was that since he couldn't bring the Belgica to the sun during the mini month where the sun disappeared behind the horizon and didn't rise again for another that was almost 3 months, since he couldn't bring the Belgica to the sun, he would bring the sun to the Belgica. So that was another one of his brilliant interventions. This is him. He developed a very close friendship with Amundsen, who would end up being the conqueror of the South Pole, but also the man to blaze through the Northwest Passage, which had eluded many explorers and led to the death of many explorers before him. And in fact, it's no exaggeration to say that Cook was Amundsen's mentor and taught him much of what Amundsen would learn about or would know about polar travel. And even when Cook would end up in Leavenworth and everybody turned against Cook, Amundsen never turned against him and always credited him as his what he called the greatest polar traveler I ever saw. So I love that, the poignancy of that relationship, the great hero crediting the much maligned Cook with teaching him everything he knew. And they would make regular excursions. That's one way that they kept themselves sane. Everybody else was stuck on the ship and didn't venture far away from it for fear of never being able to find it again in the ever fluctuating pack. Cook and Amundsen decided to take the risk. And this is one of the madmen, Adam Tollefson, who believed that his crewmates were out to murder him. This is something that has been seen several times in polar expeditions since, that there's something about there seems to be something about polar environments and icebound overwintering polar expeditions that encourages paranoia in people and a fixation on violence. And he didn't turn violent himself, but he feared it greatly, and would not sleep in the forecastle with all of his shipmates, but rather in the freezing hold among the multiplying rats. And he would often hide. He would often hide in the latrines. He would hide behind hummocks. He would mail letters to his fiancée back home in a hummock, which is sort of a mound of ice that to him looked like a mailbox. And to keep him to I guess indulge him, his shipmates would take the letters to make it seem as if they had been mailed. I don't want to too much. Yeah, and this gets into their desperate escape plans, which I won't tell too much about because I do want to leave a little bit for readers to discover themselves. But it was another demented idea of Cook's that would end up being one of the most, I guess, ambitious undertakings in the history of polar exploration. Now, I would like to. I'm not sharing anymore, am I?
No.
Okay, good. That's good.
So some of these psychological and physiological effects of the men of the Belgica you mentioned some irregular heartbeat, fatigue, depression, memory loss, confusion, and there's something you been referred to as the Antarctic stare. Can you talk about that a little bit? And these symptoms sound a little bit like long COVID.
It does, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely something I was thinking, because the COVID hit as I was making revisions, and when we didn't know about long COVID, but we did know about the I would say the effects of the psychologically troubling effects of confinement and of isolation and of uncertainty and fear. But the Antarctic stare is certainly, one psychologist, a clinician, describes it as a 12-foot stare in a 10-foot room. It's kind of like this sort of the looking into the middle distance, into nothingness, and it has been used to characterize the sort of vacant look that a lot of Antarctic scientists or research personnel or support staff or explorers have felt in the bleak midwinter months, and even afterwards. In fact, it's said that when people start exhibiting these alarming psychological mental symptoms, it's after the sun rises, and you realize that you still have it's called third quarter syndrome. You realize that you've been through so much and you still have a lot to go through, and you thought that somehow the return of the sun would mean your liberation, and it doesn't. And in fact, with the Belgica, when they expected the ice to crack up around the time in the calendar year in January and February, where they had entered the ice. In fact, the ice was miles wider than it had been, and it seemed like escape was absolutely impossible. And that's when people started losing their wits. Yeah.
What drives people, do you think, to take on these incredible risks? And is there an analog to this today?
Well, there's still explorers. There's still people. Just last week, the first, I wish I remembered her name, but the first woman of color to make a solo journey across Antarctica to the South Pole by ski. What drives her? It's not like she was a scientist. She was in the military. But I think what drives her is not necessarily the desire to discover something unknown, so much as to it's a feat of endurance and stamina, and maybe there's an element of personal challenge for her, and a lot of that is similar to what was driving a lot of these men. I don't think Amundsen had much of interest in science. He learned what he had to justify his expeditions, but he was not primarily a scientist. He was primarily, I would even say, an athlete. So there is that element of for the same reason that people run marathons, or even
Going to space.
Or going to space, or going to space. The desire to see the unknown is something we have. To see what's over the next hill is something that's built in us, not in all of us, but in some of us. And I don't think I have that desire. You could see that on the Belgica, that even those who signed on, not all of them had that outlook. One of the crew members had claimed that he was a sailor, that he knew how to, he knew no such thing. His only experience was to deliver bread on a tricycle, so like he was and he only joined because he wanted to avoid trouble back home. He got in trouble with the law. So it's not like he really wanted to. He was in fact quite scared when it came time to winter in the ice. And not everybody was cut out for it either. Even those who thought that they wanted to see the Antarctic and that they were cut out for polar exploration, like de Jour, for example, evidently he didn't have the constitution for it. Whereas people like Lecointe or Cook or Amundsen thrived. Even it's not to say they didn't suffer physically; they did, like everybody else. But they had the mental fortitude, and they were inviting those I guess challenges and that adversity. So yeah, I think I describe it in the book as some people just want to see the tops of things, and that's there's no really other way of putting it. In fact, to continue that Mallory quote that you cited, the next quote he says, or it might have been just before, and it's a more famous quote. Somebody says, "Why do you want to climb Everest?" And he answers, "Because it's there." So you can't really answer that question without resorting to some kind of tautology. You want to do it because it hasn't been done.
Right. Right. So you had access to there was more than one diary, right? And how did you get access to this? I mean, your research took you from Larchmont Library to Antarctica, right? And many
Yeah.
stops in between.
Yeah, well, yeah, I didn't find the diary in Antarctica, but yeah, I found it I found several diaries in Brussels. I was able to actually outside, closer to Ghent, there was the estate of the de Gerlache family, and in a trunk, I had randomly emailed somebody with the last name, which was an unusual last name, hoping that he was related to de Gerlache, and it turned out to be his great grandson, who's a filmmaker and quite a dashing adventurer himself. And
That's so great.
he invited me. He's climbed the highest mountain in every continent, and he invited me to the family estate and pulled out a trunk in which, among scattered paraphernalia and sounding leads and all sorts of I guess memorabilia from that expedition, were 4 bound leather books, which were the Belgica's log. And so that was for me really the key to the whole thing.
How far into your research were you at that point when
I hadn't started writing.
you hadn't started?
That was I was about 6 months into it. It was in September 2018. I hadn't even been to Antarctica yet. I went there 2 months later. But that was the key, because when I saw that handwriting on those yellowed pages, when his name is Henri de Gerlache, Henry, the two of us, he had never read through the whole thing, so the two of us were flipping through it, and I was frantically taking pictures of each page with my iPhone, and so I've thousands of pages on my iPhone. I shouldn't say thousands, there aren't that many days in the year, but at least 600 pages. With my iPhone, the two of us were reading what felt like an adventure novel. Some days there's nothing there because it's uneventful and it's as barren as the landscape around them when they were stuck in the ice. And some days, you have this whole story of a mutiny crammed into one page. It's just, it's riveting stuff, even though it's written in that sort of telegraphic or telegrammatic, style that ship's logs are written in. There's a real poetry to them. I remember the day that the ship was got caught in the ice was, I believe, early March 1898, March 3rd. The entry for that day was, we hoist the sails, the ship doesn't move. And like that, just those 4 words or 6 words, for me it was claustrophobic. It was terrifying. And you also have that in addition to that, Cook published his diary, and Amundsen also, and that diary has been translated from Norwegian. And then I found the Rakovica, who's the naturalist, had a diary. A very, very funny man. His diary was, and in addition to that, he had a series of cartoons. He, every night, to keep the men engaged and entertained, he drew these extremely bawdy, I would even say vulgar, cartoons. Excuse me, the sun is blinding. Those were a very useful resource for me. And then there was probably 3 or 4 other dives. It turned out, I was afraid at first that one of the reasons that the expedition had not been written about was that there was a dearth of primary sources, but it turned out to be one of the most well-documented expeditions of the heroic age, because of the 17 men who ended up, who remained on the ship by the time they arrived in Antarctica. Almost a dozen kept some kind of day-to-day account, and that's remarkable. Not that all of the men survived, And in fact, one of the diaries that I wish I had found was that of the man that I showed you, Adam Tollefson, who ended up going mad and living a very long life, but in an insane asylum. His diary did not survive because his shipmates were so troubled by what it contained that they burned it. So I wish I had seen that, but I found that to be a particularly Gothic detail.
We have two questions from Henry. Have you read the recent Shackleton book, Hero on Ice? And when will your book be made into a movie? And now with your new job, you should have the answer to that. So.
Right. I guess I wish I could make that happen. No, I've read portions of it. It's I've not read the whole thing, but it's by Ranulph Fiennes, who's a absolutely fantastic writer, in addition to being one of the most accomplished explorers of our generation. And so I definitely intend on finishing it. But what's remarkable is that a lot of books are written by armchair explorers like me, and so I really respect people who already have firsthand experience of the kind of hardships that the men they're writing about have experienced. So I definitely intend on finishing that one. And when will my book be a movie? Well, it's in the works. It's not in the. I shouldn't say it, but there are people interested. So
I guess with CGI, you can do anything. I can't imagine they're going to spend however long it would take. Or
no, and in fact, you're probably not allowed to film down there. I think if anything, they might film in the Arctic, but it's not at all the same thing. Yeah, it would have to be CGI like they did the Terror. So please explain why you think Shackleton succeeded where de Gerlache failed. What lessons of leadership are there? I would take issue with that. I think Shackleton succeeded in being remembered as a hero, which he was, and de Gerlache didn't. I do think that de Gerlache did not have the mental fortitude of Shackleton, that if it weren't for Cook in particular, he would not have, the expedition would not have come home to safe harbor. It's true that Shackleton saved every one of his men, and he crossed. He made an unbelievably, almost legendarily heroic crossing in an open boat. The what is it? The James M. Caird or something. It defies belief. But de Gerlache in the end ended up redeeming himself with his strategy to escape the ice. He was not. I don't think he. Again, I don't think he had the. He was not cut out for the work in the way that Shackleton was. I don't think he quite had the fortitude. But I also don't want to see him as this feckless, incapable commander. He was not. He was maybe not as inspiring as Shackleton, and I can't explain that difference except to say that some people are built differently. An interesting side note is that the two of them were friends, and in fact, the Endurance, which was Shackleton's ship that was caught in the ice of the Weddell Sea and crushed in the ice of the Weddell Sea, had initially been built for de Gerlache. It was the I forget the original name. Maybe one of the listeners can tell me. It's in the book, but Polaris, I believe. And de Gerlache couldn't afford it, and he had intended to take it to the Arctic for an expedition there. He ended up passing it along to Shackleton, who would take it straight into into the pages of the history books.
So you didn't see probably the same Antarctica that they saw because of climate change. Can you talk a little bit about that? Or
it's funny you should say that. It looked the same. In fact, I recognized a lot of the same elements of the landscape. I saw these rocky outcroppings, and it looked like nothing had changed in 120 years. It's the same. If anything, more snow has fallen, and the glaciers are thicker, and that's due to climate change in its own way. But even though it looked like a Technicolor version of the black and white landscapes that I recognized from photographs, and the illusion of similarity was just that. I went out during my week or so visit to the Jour Strait in the very same waters that the heroes or the explorers I write about had sailed through. I went out with some scientists who were taking regular measurements of the salinity and of the phytoplankton population, and they mentioned to me that because the water was slightly less, or the salinity levels had dropped because of the fresh water melt from the glaciers, that the krill, or the phytoplankton rather, that thrived in such waters was of a different nature than the phytoplankton that the penguins and seals and krill, more importantly krill, thrived on. And so that led to a shift in the entire ecosystem, and that shift was just beginning, and now it's only going to accelerate. You're already seeing the penguins that the penguins that I saw were probably, I like to imagine they were the descendants of the penguins that the expedition saw, the Gen 2 penguins and the chin straps. But now you're seeing more and more Gen 2s head south because the temperatures are rising along the north of the peninsula. So even though they're subtle, the changes are not quite as drastic as you see in other parts of the Earth, especially not the Arctic, where you see the levels of ice shrinking year by year. You're not necessarily seeing that, and temperatures are not necessarily on average climbing that much. There are the ecosystem is changing in really alarming ways.
Thank you so much, Julian. This was really fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me. This is I wrote a good portion of the book in Larchmont Library, so it feels like a homecoming of sorts.
That's awesome. Well, thank you everybody else for coming, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, and hi, Henry.